Hey everybody. So today we're going to be talking about America in the Age of Common Man. This is the period leading up to the Age of Jackson, and it's important to remember that this is still like the early stages of the United States Republic. Um, the Constitution's only a couple of decades old. The We've seen the fall of the Federalists and Alexander Hamilton. We saw the rise of Jefferson, who was followed by two other Virginians as president, James Madison and James Monroe. We saw the Louisiana Purchase almost double the size of the United States. And then we saw the War of 1812, which kind of cemented the United States on like the international stage. Um, so since like this is still in the early stages of the republic, there's a lot of transitions going on. They're still trying to figure out what do we want this country to be? How is it going to work? There's a lot of transition, which we should be able to relate to right now with this whole COVID-19 thing. Okay, so anyway, um, by about the mid 1820s, some Europeans started to come and take tours of America. The practice normally was when when someone from Europe would get into early adulthood, like when they would finish their education, before they would go start their trade or go into the university, they would take a tour around Europe. And then later on in life, they would go visit their favorite spots in Europe. And a lot of times, like, that's still the case today. A lot of British students, when they finish high school, they take what they call the gap year, where they take a year between high school and college, and they go and travel. They go backpacking. So that's still a practice that they use today. So anyway, by the mid 1820s, when those Europeans got older in life, instead of going back to their favorite places in Europe, they would come and travel into America. Um, and it was a new experience. They wanted to come in and see all the changes that were happening in America and see how different America actually was from back home in Europe. Lots of them came over, and then they would write letters and they would write books and they would send them back home, get them published. Um, and these publications are really interesting based upon what they saw was different between America and in Europe. So the most famous of these European travelers was this guy by the name of Alexis de Tocqueville. He published a bunch of books. The most famous was Democracy in America, where he was exploring the effects of the rising equality of social conditions, both on the individual and how the state interacted with the federal government. But he was just the most famous. There was a lot of European travelers that came and published things. And the big common theme that all of these guys saw was change, and it was constant and rapid. Um, they were astonished to see these new ideas and new inventions, new innovations, the new cities, how America was expanding. Um, they saw these things, and they didn't have any kind of there was no similarities to what they would see in Europe. Europe was pretty much established by this time. They were pretty much set in their ways, so they came over to America, saw all this change, and it really intrigued these guys. One French traveler said that men change their houses, their climate, their trade, their condition, their party, their sect. The states change their laws, their officers, their constitutions. The soil itself, or at least the houses, partake in the universal instability. The existence of a social order in the bosom of this whirlpool seems a miracle, an inexplicable anomaly. The pace of life in America was much faster than in Europe. Americans never really stood still. They changed their places of residence, their jobs, their professions, with a speed and frequency that really horrified these Europeans. In Europe, most people they were born in a town, they spent their whole lives in the town, held the same job, which was probably the same job that their fathers had. So this way of life, this kind of stagnant way of life, was passed down for generations. Alexis de Tocqueville, that traveler that we talked about earlier, wrote, "An American will build a house in which to pass his old age, and sell it before the roof is on. He will plant a garden and rent it just as the trees are coming into bearing. He will clear a field and leave it to others to reap the harvest. He will take up a profession and leave it, settle in one place, and soon go off elsewhere with his changing desires." Francis Grund, another one of the European travelers, wrote, "Life consists of motion, and as far as that goes, the United States presents certainly the most animated picture of universal bustle and activity of any country in the world. Such a thing as rest and quiescence does not even enter the mind of an American." So during this time, American business also flourished. Um, One traveler said that the pursuit of the almighty dollar in the United States resembled nothing so much as a holy crusade. This English lady tourist named Frances Trollope noted that one never overheard Americans conversing without the word dollar being pronounced between them. Such unity of purpose, such sympathy of feeling can, I believe, be found nowhere else except perhaps in an ant's nest. Um, so business dominated American life. Well, at least in the cities. Most of America was still the rural farmers. But in the cities, and especially in the Northeast, business was dominating everything. Francis Grund, that guy we talked about earlier, wrote, "It is as if all America were but one gigantic workshop, over the entrance of which there is blazing the inscription, 'No admission here except on business.'" Another traveler, Michael Chevalier, was a visiting French nobleman, said, "Everything here is arranged to facilitate industry. Men of business, instead of being scattered over the town, occupy a particular quarter, which is devoted exclusively to them. The manners and customs are altogether those of a working, busy society. From the moment he gets up, the American is at his work, and he is engaged in it till the hour of sleep. Pleasure is never permitted to interrupt his business. Even mealtime is not for him a period of relaxation, in which his worried mind seeks repose in the bosom of his friends. It is only a disagreeable interruption of business, an interruption to which he yields because it cannot be avoided, but which he abridges as much as possible." So with all these opportunities, America was a place where fortunes could be made, and then lost, and then made again. In Europe, the early 19th century, there were very few opportunities for the poor to gain wealth or gain status. Society was very stagnant. It was very stratified. Um, it might be possible for a wealthy industrialist to go broke, but there wasn't very much opportunity for someone of the lower classes to elevate themselves. In America, however, there was undreamed of opportunities. Several of the European visitors remarked that Americans might not make one fortune, but might make, lose, and remake fortunes several times. Michael Chevalier also noted that in America, riches and poverty follow on each other's traces, and each in turn occupies the place of the other. Whilst the great men of one day dethrone those of the past, they are already half overturned themselves by those of the morrow. Fortunes lost for a season, reputations during the twinkling of an eye. So a thing that stood out to all these European visitors was the sense of like American equality. Uh, if you weren't, as long as you weren't a slave, they were struck with the narrowness of the social ladder. Wealth was distributed a lot more equally than it was in Europe. The difference between the wealthiest and the poorest of Americans was much, much smaller than that in Europe. Um, there weren't very many beggars, and there were very few families of enormous wealth. Now, there were like the famous or the very wealthy plantation owners, but the social mobility was just so malleable that all Americans pretty much saw themselves as equal to each other, regardless of their current personal wealth, strictly based on the opportunities that was afforded everyone. Any assumptions of superiority were based strictly on wealth. Anything else, it was pretty much un-American. It didn't matter the family name, it just mattered what your wealth was like. Some tourists were horrified that everyone, regardless of status, shook hands with everyone else. Terms like lady and gentleman, which in Europe were like full of social meaning, they were meaningless in America. To admit to social distinctions in public was considered terrible and horrible behavior. Uh, More than one tourist from Europe was taken aback when they found that in a frontier hotel where they stopped for the night, that they were seated at dinner next to their valets and of their maidservants. The hosts were equally taken aback if the tourists informed them that this was their servant and that they should be fed in the servants' quarters. One German traveler noted that a group of legislators were trying to get through a crowd in an American city one day, and trying to get by, one of them yelled out, "Make way, we're the representatives of the people." To which the people replied, "Make way yourself, we are the people themselves." And just about this time, like in the 1820s and 1830s, people would start to refer to their household servants as the help. The word servant implied a difference of class, and class was kind of un-American. The help didn't really have those same implications, and Europeans were appalled by it, and so were some Americans. John Randolph of Roanoke wrote, "I love liberty, I hate equality." And what this emphasis of equality did was it made public opinion a chief determiner of political policy. Politicians now began to look with even closer scrutiny at what their people liked, what they disliked, what their prejudices were, and the attitudes of the common man. Popularity became a lot more important than good policy did. A European military officer who was on tour in America reported home that in the militia in the North, the privates elected their officers, who were not necessarily the most able of people, but they were the most popular. This, he noted, violated all sense of propriety and order. But Americans took pride in all of this. These attitudes of equality, they were inexorably tied to American notions of nationalism. Equality was like liberty, and liberty was the American Republic itself. Um, and if you dared risk that, you might be looking for a fight. Uh, However, humility was not one of the character traits listed by the Europeans. Americans they were brash, loud, and they were lacking in refinement. Their table manners were a source of constant horrified fascination to the European visitors. Americans ate poorly prepared and seasoned food quickly, inefficiently, and quietly. They washed it down with water or with whiskey or with ale instead of that fine wine, and they all ate together. The Europeans, they looked at dining as something that was defined by class, and Americans just didn't. They saw dining as a necessity that provided energy for business and industry and work. Uh, Dress and fashion was the same problem. In Europe, what you wore defined who you were. The clothes both made and defined the social status of the man or woman in Europe. In America, the Europeans couldn't use those same signals of dress to identify someone. The confused Europeans couldn't tell whether they had just shaken hands or were conversing with the president of the local bank, the mayor, or a day laborer in his best suit. And the place of women also confused these European visitors. Americans presumed that all women were ladies. The period produced an almost nauseating praise of the American woman. Harriet Martineau, an English feminist who visited America in the 1800s, was practically driven nuts by this new American literature of praise. James Fenimore Cooper wrote of American women, "We believe them to be the repositories of the better principles of nature. Retired within the sacred precincts of her own abode, she is preserved from the destroying taint of excessive intercourse with the world. She must be sought in the haunts of her domestic privacy, and not amid the wrangling deceptions and heart-burnings of keen and sordid traffic. The husband can retire from his own sordid struggles with the world to seek consolation and correction from one who is placed beyond their influence." These American upper class women, they were expected to retire in their homes. They were supposed to concern themselves with the gentle arts and ignore such sordid activities as politics and business. And we might try to compare these to the women on the frontier, and there, women were no better off than men, and sometimes even worse. 1 in 3 of the frontier women died during childbirth. They worked in the fields alongside the men. They defended their homes alongside the men, did work with the rest of the family, and was expected to do all of the housework. Now, some inequality existed in this period, especially in the Northeast and in those trade cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston, and in the South, where the great planters had their own social distinctions. These powerful northern magnates imitated European styles and tastes, but they still couldn't meet the European standards of the gentle breeding of the upper class. The British say that it takes 3 generations to make a gentleman from a successful tradesman, 3 generations living at leisure on money that you didn't earn. Rich Americans didn't really want to wait. So in the 1820s and 1830s, what happened was is the first self-improvement book industry appeared, and there would be these manuals of manners and like how to become a gentleman in 10 easy lessons. 28 of these were published in the 1830s, and most of them were bestsellers. Um, it took a lot to make a European style gentleman out of an American style gentleman. Here's an example of a social gathering at a society gentleman at a recital described by British tourist Francis Trollope. The gentlemen spit, talk of elections and the price of produce, and spit again. And at a theatre, men came into the lower tier of boxes without their coats, and I have seen tucked up to the shoulder. The spitting was incessant, and the mixed smell of onions and whiskey was enough to make one feel even the drakes acting dearly, bought by the obligation of enduring its accompaniments. In other words, it might take more than a how-to book just to turn an American wannabe gentleman into a refined European-style gentry. But in the South, you could tell who the important people were just by their military titles. The successful planters were militia officers, the higher rank in society and the higher rank in the militia. Colonels and majors dominated Southern society. Mrs. Trollope tells of a trip on a steamboat up the Mississippi, and she notes that the gentlemen in the cabin would certainly, from their language, manners, nor appearance, have received that designation in Europe, but we soon found that their claim to be gentlemen rested on more substantial ground, for we heard them all addressed by the titles of General, Colonel, and Major. On remarking that it was strange that there were no captains among them, Mrs. Trollope was told that the captains were all on deck. She goes on to describe the eating habits of these military gentlemen. The total want of all courtesies of the table, the voracious rapidity of which viands were seized and devoured, the strange uncouth phrases and pronunciation, the loathsome spitting, from the contamination of which it was absolutely impossible to protect our dresses, the frightful manner of feeding with their knives till the whole blade seemed to enter their mouth, and still the more frightful manner of the cleaning of the teeth afterwards with a pocket-knife, soon forced us to feel that we were not surrounded by the generals, colonels, and majors of the old world, and that dinner hour was to be anything rather than an hour of enjoyment. And American religion also astounded these European visitors, who, based upon the European model, they were convinced that any stable society demanded, if not an absolute uniformity of religion like the Spaniards and their Catholicism, then at least like a stable state church like the Anglican Church in England. But by the 1820s, there was no national state religion in the United States, and most states had ceased to have any kind of established state-funded religion. Um, Instead, there were dozens of different religious sects, going from all the way to the conservative Episcopals, all the way to the not so conservative Pentecostals. Um, and by European standards, the United States should have either been plunged into some kind of like anarchy and atheism, like at best, or religious civil war at worst. But what in fact happened was it was sort of like a free market for religion. Preachers had to compete with each other for their congregations, and in general, that meant religion, no matter what the sect was, became attuned to the needs of as wide of a range of worshippers as possible, sort of like the political arena as well. Um, Since the 1830s, there was an upsurge in demand for revivalism, and ministers of all sects competed to give the people what they wanted. The result was this like new revivalism in America, and it was often called the Second Great Awakening. Um, there was a huge amount of diversity of religions, and every year saw some kind of variation or some kind of schism of existing sects, or like a recombination of different ones into even more options. Simultaneously, acceptance of religious toleration and a strong religious feeling in America shocked these Europeans. But as they began to realize the religious diversity, it didn't necessarily mean anarchy and atheism. And they also began to realize something that they had really known all along anyway, that majority rule didn't really establish complete liberty for all, and instead it might be used to cause a tyranny of the majority. Combine majority rule on one hand with an obsession with public opinion on the other, and you can easily suppress any minority. Alexis de Tocqueville made the observation that nothing in the United States is capable of resisting the majority if you are within the very wide realm of the mainstream in religion or politics in the United States. You can defend your right to be a bit different. But if you are outside of that mainstream public opinion and majoritarianism, that will destroy your right to be different, and maybe you. In Connecticut, Roman Catholicism was outside the mainstream. The result was the burning of convents and Catholic churches. Mormons were hounded out of New York and Illinois and Ohio, and their founder, Joseph Smith, was even murdered. They were finally forced to find refuge in Utah, and even then they were chased by the U.S. troops. In politics, you can be a Jacksonian Democrat or a Jeffersonian Republican, a Whig, or even a lonely Federalist. But if you were any kind of politically active abolitionist, look out. Because even where places where abolitionism was beginning to become fashionable as a social position, like in Massachusetts, you were still probably in trouble because you were outside of the mainstream. And the American press also confused these Europeans. There were so many newspapers. Between 1833 and 1837 in New York, there were 34 different newspapers started. That's not even counting the ones that were already established. And everybody read the papers. They were cheap, they were easy to read, and they were violently partisan. They were used as a propaganda form of media, and this really became the first kind of form of mass media. Andrew Jackson understood the power of the press as a propaganda instrument. He wasn't the first. The revolutionary papers had been a propaganda tool of either patriots or the Tories, depending on which side that they were on. But newspapers were employed in the political propaganda wars of the Federalists and the Republicans as well. The papers could shape and direct public opinion and could direct political action. Newspapermen were seen as despicable characters, but Andrew Jackson knew their power and he employed them regularly. The newspaper became the field upon which politics, especially presidential politics, were played. Okay, so what does all this mean? What was happening in the United States in the 1820s, and how would it shape the nation? So remember, in the early 1800s, a debate had begun over what kind of nation the United States was going to become. What was going to be the place of government? On one side, there was Alexander Hamilton with big federal government, big business, and on the other side, there was Thomas Jefferson who liked the small yeoman farmer and not a very small federal government. And for the most part, you could say that the age of the common man was kind of like a synthesis between the two. Business was booming, but it was kind of a smaller government and a common man type feel, that egalitarian feel that Thomas Jefferson liked. So another answer is it was growing in its own way in its own time. It was adapting and it was transitioning, kind of rolling with the punches. The most of the Americans they were Democratic and majoritarian in their politics, which was very Jeffersonian of them. But there were also staunch free marketers, which was very Hamiltonian. They were always out for what one historian called the best chance. And they might worry about the results of wealth and they were certainly much more enthusiastic about the market than Jefferson was. But they were in the market up to their elbows anyway, getting all that they could for it. So as America adapts and changes and tries to figure out what it's going to become, we're going to enter the age of Andrew Jackson, which will come next week.